Good afternoon, everyone. Today, Fantasy of Flight would like to welcome you to our Veterans Weekend celebration and another of our Legends and Legacy Symposium with panelists, Senior Master Sergeant E.A. Rick Julian, Lt Col Morey Schallenberger, and your host, aviator, mechanic, and educator, Mr. Bob Locke.
Thank you, Mike. Great group today. We have a really nice show, and how about the mighty fantasy art players here that did this great job. Most of you might remember the mighty Carson art players that were really good on TV a few years ago. Well, welcome again to Fantasy, and if you're a regular, welcome back. I'm sure there's veterans in the audience. Can you raise your hand? And, oh man, I would go through and ask you, each one of you, what service, but there's just a number, and I'm thrilled to have you here. And we all thank you so much for your service. You know, we're all vets, including me. I'm a newcomer. On behalf of Kermit Weeks, this is a nice series that we're doing here, Legends and Legacies. Yesterday, we had two panels. The first was Lon Cooper, and we did civilian pilot training and war training service, which was civilians training World War II pilots in the primary phase. And Lon taught right here in Lakeland when there was a flight school here in World War II. And the afternoon was a great session. We had Sergeant Virgil Myers, 94 and a half years old, a survivor of the Battle of the Bulge. And Sergeant Teddy Fisk, D-Day +2 on Omaha Beach. Was a thrill. Today, we shift gears and we move into I would say a modern era, but my gosh, the Vietnam War the conflict was 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago. So today, let's welcome Senior Master Sergeant Rick Julian. He was in charge of the largest dog kennel in the world in Vietnam, training handlers and dogs as sentries. And he has some wonderful stories for us about what he did in Vietnam. And Morey over here flew the Grumman Mohawk. There's a model of it, and afterwards during show and tell you'll be able to see this. But he flew the Grumman Mohawk on surveillance missions at night over the jungle using a SLAR system, which was side-looking airborne radar. And he was looking for any kind of movement in the jungle. And you know, the Vietnam conflict was much different than World War II. In World War II, the President, Roosevelt, appointed supreme commanders, and they said, go win the war. And they did. The Vietnam conflict was kind of run by Washington, D.C. and the politicians. And we were successful, but we didn't win the war. And that was mainly the difference. The other small difference was in World War II, the enemy wore uniforms. In Vietnam, they didn't. And they hid in the jungles. So it was very, very difficult. And so with that, we'll start. Rick, sir, tell us a little bit about what you did, where you were, and some feeling and some thoughts, maybe a typical day over there.
First of all, I need to briefly explain my background, the thing that led me to Vietnam. For a number of years, I've been a security policeman, and for all of you who don't really know what a security cop does, he spends a lot of time in the flight line taking care of Morey's airplanes. And I decided one night that, you know, it gets so damn lonely out here. maybe I ought to try to become a dog handler. So I went to school, became a dog handler. Long story short, liked that so much I thought, you know, I think I could teach in this business. So I applied for Sentry Dog School at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, was accepted and instructed there for 7 years. From there, I spent 3 years in Japan at the Air Force Dog Training Center, just outside Tachikawa. So I had quite a bit of experience in the dog business. When I was notified I was going to Vietnam, I went over to Vietnam on October 24th of 1970. Some of you will find this a bit strange, but it was the best year of my 25-year Air Force career, with one exception. I did have to leave my wife and my 4 kids at home. Why was it a good year? Because we did your job, and you kept your nose clean. Nobody bothered you. There were no Mickey Mouse teams, as we like to call them. You just go out and do what you're supposed to do. It was a fine year. All of our memories, I think, work probably the same way. We tend to remember all the good times, and some of the bad times we just kind of forget. Some of those things you can't forget. As Bob said, it was the largest dog section in the world, 125 dogs. I had 100 or so handlers. So when I got to Vietnam, it was no surprise to me that they wanted me to take charge of that dog kennel, which I did, and which proved to be one of the bigger challenges of my life. Cameron Bay is the term they like to use to describe it is sprawling. It had all the things that you would normally associate with an air base, several bomb dumps, of which we lost one while I was there, because we had visitors one night, and a 28-mile perimeter. Now, our dogs went out and they had to try to secure that perimeter. There's no fence out there. There's no, this is where you can go, and Sir Charles, or Charlie, D.C., you're okay there, but don't step over here. Most unusual way to deal with a combat situation. Take that with rules of engagement. The Air Force, or higher, I should say, way above my pay grade, somebody determined that under rules of engagement, we were not to fire upon anyone unless they fired at us first. What we had to hope for was that Charlie, or Sir Charles, if you want to be formal, was a bad shot. And in most cases, he was. That's the beginning of my story, and I'll run it back to you, Bob, please.
Thanks, Rick. This is some great stuff. This should be taped and put on TV. Morey, you had a different view of it. You had a view of what it was like above the jungle, but you flew at night mostly, so you didn't see a whole lot. Give us an idea of what you did with the Mohawks.
Well, I got to Vietnam on the 23rd of December, 1967, newly promoted to captain, and our unit was called the 245th Surveillance Airplane Company out of Marble Mountain. It was just outside of Da Nang in the northern part of South Vietnam. And as a new captain, we didn't get the jobs that we would like to have. I was, my normal job during the daytime was a supply officer and a property book officer. At nighttime, I flew the Mohawk. This is a model of it here, except it had a boom underneath it, stretched 22 feet long, and that held the antenna for the side-looking airborne radar. I guess a typical night for me would be eat supper. We would maybe play some volleyball or something for an hour or two, and then about 9 o'clock I would start getting ready for a mission. check to see where I was supposed to go that night, and get the aircraft ready to take off. And there were just two of us on board. I was the pilot. There was only one set of controls. The enlisted man that was beside me, he ran the equipment for the side-looking airborne radar. We would take off maybe around 11:30, maybe midnight, and head to our destination maybe 45 minutes away. I normally flew Ashaw Valley and the demilitarized zone. That was kind of my two areas that I patrolled. The side-looking airborne radar would look out on either side of the aircraft about 20 kilometers or about 18 miles, and it would pick up any movement on our screen that, and it put a little fly speck, you might say, on the screen. That meant that there was a movement of at least 3 miles an hour from a vehicle. We would then turn around, and if we found a lot of them, we would turn around and plot it again, and then call in either F-4s out of gunfighter squadron, it was called, out of Da Nang, or we call in artillery. We would also call in B-52 strikes, and we would tell them to hit such and such point at such and such time, and hopefully we would disrupt the North Vietnamese as they were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because this was the build-up to Tet starting in February of 1968, so they were moving lots of supplies and lots of personnel down. That was a mission that lasts probably about 4 to 4.5 hours. Sometimes if we put ferry tanks on, it could last up to 7.5 to 8 hours. We sat in Martin Baker ejection seats, about as soft as this stage is, because it would shoot you out the top if you had to go, and thank God I never did. But they still got, it was very uncomfortable. You were strapped in with your legs, with your waist, and with your shoulders. So you could just kind of wiggle, and that was about it. It had to be that way because if you had to eject, it would shoot you out the top. You would pull 9 Gs, you would black out, and hopefully everything would go okay. Your seat would separate from you and your parachute would open. But thank God that never happened to me. So that was kind of a typical day. I would come back and land about 6:30, go eat breakfast, sleep till about noon, eat lunch, and then do my supply officer, property book officer items until supper time. That was a typical day. This went on 7 days a week.
Thank you, Morey. When I was in the service, I was in the 2nd Armored Division in Fort Hood, Texas, from '61 to '64, and even though I had a MOS for helicopters, rotary wing, I worked fixed wing. I worked Cessna L-19s and de Havilland L-20 Beavers, and the Army sent me to OB-1 factory school that they had there on post, 5 days long. And beforehand, Morey and I were talking about the Martin Baker ejection seat, and that was really something in those days, and it just literally rocketed you right out the top of the airplane in case you needed to depart. And 9 Gs, well, you'll be asleep, at least during the 9 Gs, so that's really something. Morey, while we're talking about this, I'm interested in, I've always been interested in navigating, especially you're navigating at night over the jungle and it's black. There obviously are no lights or very few lights as you get away from Da Nang, or Marble Mountain. How did you navigate? It seemed to me you get out there and you turn around and you say, oops, which way do I go home? And there's only one way to go home, and that's the right way. So how did you navigate?
Well, to get home, it was called feet wet, and you just headed east until you got over the South China Sea. But going out to our positions where we were to fly, we knew we had to fly about northwest. We'd soon run out of any navigational aids that were along the coast. So once we get over to our area that we started our missions on, again, the Ashaw Valley was roughly north and south, we would rely on our imagery coming up from our side-looking airborne radar. The only problem was it came up 9 miles or 3 minutes. It took 3 minutes for it to come up, which meant that I was ahead of that imagery by 9 miles. And it was also upside down, reversed. So it was hard at first to try to be able to navigate and keep out of Laos. We weren't supposed to be flying in Laos. And we really had to keep out of North Vietnam because we would get shot down up there. But like I said, we got real good at navigating off of our imagery. I flew the OV-1B, which was the one with the side-looking airborne radar. Two of the other aircraft, the OV-1A, flew on in the daytime. It used cameras and visual, so they flew at a much lower altitude than I did. And then the OV-1 Charlie, or C model, had the infrared. They both used a system called Doppler, which was very unreliable. You had to upgrade it about 3 times before you ever took off on a mission to see if you could get it calibrated right. And still, they relied on maps most of the time. When we were flying at night, there was no need to pull out a map because it was pitch black. I was normally in the clouds, and so we just flew along and watched our imagery, and that 4.5 hours went real fast because sometimes we were quite busy calling in any type of movement that we could find. As we got ready, tanks would get low, we would start heading back to Da Nang. We would do an instrument approach into Da Nang using an instrument landing system. And as we broke out under the clouds, if we did, we could then go 3 miles east of Da Nang, right on the water where Marble Mountain was, and we could land there. If we couldn't break out under the clouds, we would go back around and try it one more time. The third time around, and I don't know why we never thought of this, we would come down as low as we could over Da Nang, then we would head east. We'd set our radar altimeter to 50 feet. We would gradually come down until we reached, got under the clouds or 50 feet, whichever. If we got under the clouds, we could sneak back and land at Marble Mountain. If we couldn't break out, then we would head to an alternate landing place. That's why we had to have about an hour's worth of fuel on board where we could fly to an alternate location and land.
Isn't that incredible? That's, you know, the seat of the pants, and if you're an aviator or you're a pilot and you fly somewhere and you get disoriented, which is lost. I've been in that situation more than once, and it's a scary position because...
Bob, I forgot to tell you one thing. When we were doing that let down over the water, down to maybe 50 feet, we forgot about things out there like ships. Thank God we never hit one of them, but they were out there.
Yeah, it's, like I say, it's a scary thing and then here they are, they're on instruments, and you know, they've got to let down through the clouds, and you're hoping that when you break out that there's the field in front of you. Was the field lit? Did they light it for you when you landed?
We normally had the field lit except during TET. Whenever we lit the airfield runway, we would get rockets and mortars coming in. So what they would do, we could kind of see the perimeter lights around our compound, which was kind of like a big oblong circle or oval. And we knew that the runway was roughly north-south and roughly in the center of those perimeter lights. We would come in on short final, and we never turned our landing light on until we were just about ready to land. We would turn the landing light on. Of course, we already have our gear down and our flaps down. If the runway was in front of us, we could go ahead and land. If we got off a little ways, we had to go around. Our runway was made out of perforated steel planking. And when I first got there, it was, I think, 4,300 feet long. This perforated steel planking is a sheet of metal, perforations in it. You could hook them together. They were about 3 feet wide and probably 16 feet long. And they were just meshed together. And they laid them right on top of the sand, and then we'd land on that. That's the same way our parking lot was. We used revetments that we made out of 50-gallon oil drums, filled those with sand, and stood those 3 high so that we could somehow, hopefully, protect the aircraft. Of course, you wouldn't protect them if a mortar or a rocket would come in and make a direct hit on the revetment, because that would destroy the aircraft.
So, Rick, following on with Morey's conversation, we talked about your dogs and the guarding of airfields and the guarding of airplanes, if you will. And tell us a little bit about the training of the dogs. And I remember the first time we talked, you had to also train the handlers.
Oh, that's very true, Bob. When you marry, and that was a term that we used loosely, but when you marry a dog to this man, this young handler, the way you train this dog, and like I told Bob at an earlier symposium, sometimes the dog ends up training the handler. But, you know, the way you train this dog is that you marry him up with a handler, and this handler does everything for the dog. He feeds him, he takes him to the vet. Now, of course, the dog may not appreciate the trip to the vet, but this dog begins to realize that he has one friend in the world, and if something happens to that friend, who's going to feed him? Who's going to take care of him? Who's going to groom him? In dog's mind, I mean, the German Shepherd primarily is what we use, and they're superior animal in so many ways. But they're also a dog, you know? I mean, they don't have quite the brain capacity that most of us have. Some are smarter than others. The Shepherd is a very smart breed. But anyway, that's what made this such an effective team when you put them out there in the jungle or in the sand or wherever they needed to work. That dog knew that he had better do his damnedest to take care of that handler, or he might not get fed when the ship's over. The dog would take a snake bite to protect the handler. If there was gunfire, he didn't drop down and look for a hole. He was up. He would take a shot if that had to happen. The worst thing that could happen to us as supervisors was to have one of our handlers go down for whatever reason. And you would go out there to assist the handler. And look what you've got yourself into. This animal doesn't want you near him. And what you would end up having to do is tranquilize the dog to get to the handler. That's how devoted they were. They were terrific. Like I said, the Shepherd was just a terrific animal. You could use him in Vietnam today in the 100-degree temperatures, which seldom ever varied. Or you could move him to Alaska tomorrow. He didn't care. He had a dual coat. He was perfectly insulated from the heat and from the cold. Very, very smart, great eyesight, and hearing and smell so far superior to any human being you could imagine. I said earlier that we had about 100 Air Force handlers there. They were kids. I thought they were kids. They were 19, 20, 21. When I got there, I was 12 days past my 35th birthday. And I think it was polite. They politely referred to me as the old man. And I'm thinking, I'm 35, kids, you know, come on, not over the hill quite yet. There was a great camaraderie there among handlers, among the dogs. And we were greatly respected too, because I think, and I know in Morey's case, the flying type guys, they knew how vital it was that when they walked back out to that airplane tomorrow, that it'll still be like they left it. And that was our job, to try to keep these airplanes and our equipment and what have you, all in one piece. And let me say one thing before I turn it back to Bob. When I hear these guys talk, and I've spent quite a bit of time with them now, and we talk about an injection seat that shoots you out like a rocket, that's why I like being on the ground.
Well, Bob, did these dogs, did you also take them out on patrols out in the jungle and places like that?
On most air bases, what we were charged with was the responsibility of the perimeter. I think I mentioned that Cameron Bay had a 28-mile perimeter. We had the South China Sea on one side, and we had Cameron Bay on the other side. With 100 dogs, you can do the math. How much area can you cover on 28 miles with 100 dogs? What we did, we had several things we did. We varied the patrol routes. So if we were being observed night after night, there was no set pattern. We did a lot of squirreling little things. And since the statute of limitations has probably run out, I don't worry about some of the stuff that we did. I don't think the government will come knock on my door today. They got big fish to fry. You did what you had to do. It was the same thing with equipment. For you all that were in Vietnam, you know what I'm about to say is very true. You needed to know how to scrounge. You needed to know how to barter. Otherwise, you didn't have anything. So the trading game became quite, maybe not lucrative, that's not the word. And my goodness, if you could lay your hands on a 45 caliber pistol, you were king. And why anybody really wanted that weapon, I'll never know, because if you weren't at point blank range, you probably weren't going to hit the side of a barn. Anyway, back to you, Bob.
What a great discussion with these fine folks. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this. I just love it. Maura, you talked about you were in Germany for a while, and though Rick wasn't there, that the dogs protected your airplane when you weren't there.
That's correct. I was stationed in Hanau, Germany, which was about 20 miles east of Frankfurt. If we couldn't get into Hanau, our airfield, we would have to land at Frankfurt. And the minute we would land, the air police would come out with 3 air policemen along with 1 dog. We would put 6 padlocks on the vital parts of the aircraft. And they would put a fencing around the aircraft, and then no one would get in to get to that aircraft. Either the pilot that flew it in had to come back and get it, or he had to bring a slip of paper from the commanding officer that he was authorized to go in and get the aircraft. One other thing I wanted to talk about scrounging. As I was a supply officer and a property book officer, we brought in lots of materials for the aircraft and for our vehicles and things like that. We also had our hooches, we call them, built by the Seabees, and the Navy Seabees were outstanding. They could put up a building in about a day, and you could move in. Well, they put up the building, but a lot of times they just have screen over. We'd have a 4-foot-high plywood and then a window with a screen on it. Well, like Rick said, it was hot there. So we had a guy go to the Philippines on one of the C-141s that was packing wounded people back so they'd go back to the States. When he got to the Philippines, he bought 150 air conditioners and brought them back to Da Nang, and we got them over to Marble Mountain. We put those in the windows, and but then that would close up all the windows, so it was dark in there all the time. Well, as a property book officer, I would go down to the Navy Yard at Camp Tinshaw, right next to China Beach, and scrounge things. One of the things I scrounged was a pallet of plexiglass. Not a pallet of plywood, but a pallet of plexiglass. And we had what we call, you had different stages of priority to pick things up, and I used the highest priority, an O2 walkthrough, which meant you had to have it now. They couldn't figure out why I wanted to have this plexiglass, plus a whole pallet of it. And just then, one of the Mohawks happened to fly over, and I said, well, see these windows on the side of the Mohawk, they're curved. And we have to put, we get shot out all the time, and we need to put new windows in. But the guy said, well, but this plywood is flat, or this plexiglass is flat. He said, well, we use blowtorches and we torch the windows so that they get into shape. We got our pallet of plywood, or of plexiglass. We then put in windows in all of our hooches and our headquarters and our dining, our mess hall and our officers club and the NCO club. So that worked.
You know, if I could add something on this, on do-it-yourself projects. At our kennel, we were the highest point on Cameron Bay. We could literally look down and watch the airplanes on the runway and what have you. But we had water and we had electricity up on Canine Hill. But we had no other facilities, if you get my drift. Now, with a bunch of men, it's not really a major problem, depending on which end of the body you were going to have to work on. And I had a young man that worked for me, kennel support is what we call him. He was one of these, the kind of people you gotta have. You tell him what you want, and then I would always say, now don't tell me where you got it. Because, you know, I thought one of us would probably go to jail, why should both of us go? But we didn't have a latrine facility. So he said to me, why don't we just build one? I said, you gotta be kidding. You're gonna build a latrine up here? He said, yeah, no problem. He said, give me about an hour or two, off he went. Long story short, we built an outhouse. Even to the point that it had the half moon in the door. We also decided that we needed a cemetery next to our kennel. And it was all jungle. And I said to this kid, I said, oh, come on, man. We got to get all 100 of these guys up here. We'll work for a week trying to get this cleared out. He said, yeah, I got an idea. So I'll be right back. Gone about 2 hours, and I hear a heavy vehicle coming back up the hill. And it's a bulldozer. And he's in it. And he bulldozed the jungle out. We built the cemetery. Put a flagpole up. We scrounged that too. Went out, found a piece of pipe, hung the American flag up, and I guess it was a couple days later, a young officer, lieutenant, happened to come up and wander around, and he said, nice cemetery, got your flag up. You do light it at night, don't you? I said, no, sir. I don't think that's too wise to light this up at night. And he said, look, he said, that's the rules. You have got to do that. I tell the young guy who's working with kennel support, he was a kid from New Jersey. Not that that makes any difference. But he said, hey, I got a friend back in Congress. I'll write the letter. Which he did. And the letter he ended up sending it to was Lyndon Johnson. And we got a reply back, and obviously I don't imagine Lyndon Johnson ever saw that letter. But it told us in clear technology, clear language, you fly that damn flag out however you want.
Oh, yeah. Indeed. Morey, I recall a story, I'm starting to get, my age is creeping up on me, but you had an interesting landing there in the Mohawk, going into Da Nang, did you not? Did you talk about trying to get in and it was really bad? Remember that? Can you share, please?
Yes. This was during, again, during TED of 1968, I think probably February, March time frame. We had spotted some North Vietnamese that were between Da Nang and Chu Lai. Chu Lai is about 50, 60 miles south of Da Nang. And they were closing in on Chu Lai. So what we would do, we would fly the Mohawk with the SLAR to pick up any movement, and then we would bring in our infrared bird and pinpoint those targets. And then we had what they call Puff the Magic Dragon, which is like a C-47 sitting out here that had the Gatling guns on the side of the aircraft, plus a 105 millimeter howitzer. And we would spot the aircraft, or spot the enemy, and the other OV-1C would pinpoint it and then Puff would destroy it. Well, when I took off, I was flying a plane that the fuel gauge, the amount of fuel you used would just spin instead of being at a certain point, it was just spinning there. So I knew I had about 4 hours, 4.5 hours of flight time. We were, however, flying low level during this time, and a lot of times we would be going faster than we normally travel. We normally travel about 180 knots, around 195, 200 miles an hour. So as I got toward the end of my fuel, I thought I needed to start looking for places to land. And again, we were under attack at the present time. I checked with, and I could see at Da Nang, they were under attack. Chu Lai was under attack. And Phu Bai, the airfield that I would go to up north, about another 75 to 100 miles north of us, was also under attack. So the only place I could go was to Ubon, Thailand, which was 200 miles away. I didn't have enough fuel. So what I decided to do is, again, the airfield was pitch black, and in fact, the perimeter lights were out at that time. I thought I could find the airfield. So I found the airfield, I started in and turned my landing light on. I'd missed the runway. So back around I went, and I did this twice, and then my 20-minute fuel warning light came on. So I knew I had 20 minutes to spare, or I was going to have to take it out to sea and either eject over the water rather than over land. I would take my chances with the sharks versus the Viet Cong and going maybe becoming a POW. So my final shot in, turned my landing light on, and lo and behold, there was the runway right in front of me. I immediately landed. The mortars and the rockets weren't hitting the airfield at the time, and I made it in.
When you're a pilot, there ain't nothing worse than watching the fuel gauge go down and empty. And especially when you're out over the jungle or you're out over the water. And it seemed to me when I was flying my old biplane, whenever I got out of the water, that engine ran really bad. I could just feel every shake, and I thought, boy, I'm going to get wet. Great story. We have a couple of minutes left. This has been a marvelous panel. Thank you guys so much. Rick, you have a story to tell that is, I don't know whether it's on the not so bright side of your experience. And I remember the story so well that I thought about it for days and days and days. Would you share, please?
It's a tough story to tell.
Yes. You want to tell it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, because people need to hear it.
Okay.
Probably history will record the Vietnam War was the first war that we encountered widespread drug abuse and use in the ranks. Now please understand, I'm not speaking about the Army, the Navy, the Marine, and the Coast Guard. I just know what I saw and what I endured with the Air Force. And I'm certainly not painting all veterans who were in Vietnam as drug users, not for 1 second. I wasn't. But a lot of them were. And you might say, well, I wonder why. Several reasons. First reason maybe being drugs were easily gotten. And they were cheap. And booze was cheap. Right? I won't exclude alcohol because that was a problem as well. And I think what happened along about 1968, 69, because you talk to the Moreys and the guys who were there in the years earlier than that, you don't really hear this problem so much. But I think about 68, 69, if you think back what was going on in our country, going into 70, we were having the student unrest, we were having the demonstrations, the baby killer attachment to the Vietnam vets. And that's all these kids, and again, they were kids, that's all these kids heard over there. You know, and they become very disgruntled, and I can understand why. It was very difficult to deal with the morale factor because they saw no reason for us to be there anymore. What I began to notice in the last 3 or 4 months that I was there seemed to be quite a bit of increased activity of 707s coming into Cameron Bay. Maybe they were coming from Thompson Newton where they'd been first. And I'd come to find out that these 2 or 3 flights a week were loaded with drug users. They were being returned to the States. A lot of people don't like to hear that, but it's the truth. On each of these flights, they would designate a security policeman to escort them back home. Now, I'll be quite frank with you, I never quite understood that. What are you going to do at 35,000 feet? But let that go, whatever, however you want to do it. I was due to rotate on the 24th of October 1971. Airports had a very, very stern policy. You went to Vietnam for 1 year, 365 days. You did not come home a day before. You might be 2 or 3 days late. They didn't care about that. But you were going to serve the year. I got a knock on my door on 14th of October. So you're going to be down at the terminal tomorrow morning at 6:30. I said, well, can you give me any reason why you want me down there at 6:30? I had a bit of an attitude, you see. And they said, well, yeah, we're going to put you on a flight back in the States. I said, I don't rotate till the 24th. They said, you're putting me on the drug flight. I said, well, does that mean that I get back to the States, then I got to turn around, catch another plane back here to finish the 2 weeks that I got left for the 10 days? And amazingly, they said, no, you can stay there. And that's just not like the logic the military works with. But anyway, they told me, you'll need civilian clothes. And I said, well, what do I need civilian clothes for? I said, I'll fly home in my uniform. I said, I'm telling you, you take civilian clothes. We're going to fly you into SeaTac, which is Seattle, Tacoma. And once all of those drug guys are removed, and gals, there were some, not many, then you're to get into the SeaTac airport, and the first thing you do is go to the men's room, and you get out of the uniform. You do whatever you want with the uniform. You can put it in the trash can, but get into civilian clothes. Then if you had a nice wool cap, you can pull down over your ears so they can't see the military short hair. That would be nice too. And then boogie yourself through that terminal as quickly as you can, because you're not welcome. Tough. Really, really tough. The other thing I would add is that another reason why maybe some of these kids got into the drug business was because they knew that once they got busted, they were going back to the States. And maybe that's the price they paid to get out of there. I don't know.
Thank you, Rick. I know it's tough. Thank you, Morey. Thank you so much. And thank you, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this. These guys were on a panel that we had here. There were 5, and it was Memories of Vietnam. It was probably the best panel I did. And you see why.